We praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, thank him and glorify him for all his blessings and bounties that he's bestowed upon us. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, as we, come here to week 10 and our weekly discussion, we ask Allah that, he purifies our intentions and that we're able to, speak what is true, and any benefits from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, any shortcomings from ourselves. So that being said, all right, can you hear? See here, Anna saying you can't hear. Can you hear? All right. Can you? Yes. Okay. So today's topic is political engagement from the Muslim perspective. So one disclaimer I want to say is that from the get-go, that this is not about a debate about whether to vote or not to vote. There's a lot of scholarly debate about that. The more focus is on the bigger picture about the whole idea of political engagement, and is going to delve into that. Also, we have with us on a regular, as we do every week, alhamdulillah, we have with us Dr. Rami and also Imam Insharah will be joining us shortly. Brother Mouhannad will be doing a presentation on the topic, inshallah, in the premise of how to approach political engagement, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. And if you want, you can send the questions to me, or you can put them in the chat. All right, and then inshallah we try to address them as many as possible. If we don't finish everything tonight, all right. If we don't finish everything tonight, inshallah we can continue this discussion on a different day. So that being said, I'm going to pass it on. Unless Dr. Rami, you want to add anything, Dr. Rami? All right, I want to pass it on to Brother Mouhannad, and inshallah, bismillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Is my audio working? Can you hear me? Yes? All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Bismillah wa salli ala rasulillah. Allah yarham khali Yasmin. I wanted to start today. Thank you, Hassan, for the introduction to the topic. And I wanted to start today with a quote I just saw a couple of days ago that I thought was pretty on point. And the quote is by Dr. Hatem al-Hajj. And the quote is that politics is not like chemistry or physics. It intersects with religion in profound ways. Separation of church and state may have a valid meaning in Islam. Separation of religion and politics does not. And inshallah, through this presentation, we could maybe essentially expound on that, because I think the end of that quote is sums up quite a bit of what we're trying to talk about today. So what does it mean to be engaged politically as a Muslim? We talk about Muslim political engagement. We have no shortage of organizations that have the word Muslim or Islamic in their title. We are constantly speaking as Muslims or in the name of Muslims, for Muslims, in the name of Islam, whatever it may be, in our political engagement. But what does it actually mean to be politically engaged as Muslims? I submit, and throughout this presentation, if I say anything that I believe is just my own personal opinion, I will say I submit something, very much open to be questioned or challenged on that or corrected. But I submit that engaging politically as a Muslim may include many things, but at a very minimum, it includes two things. And that, number one, is our goals are determined based on Islamic values and hierarchies of priorities, right? And number two is that our means are Islamically valid, right? It's not just the ends that have to be Islamically valid, but the means have to be as well. Somebody like Hassan or Sheikh Insharah or Dr. Rami could add more to that, but I think that at a minimum, if we want to say that we're politically engaged as Muslims, this has to be a necessary requirement to our engagement. So it means very little that we announce or associate our Muslim identity with our actions if we don't actually calibrate those actions and our rhetoric to Islam. And in fact, we have to be very wary. It's a very common statement now. You commonly hear this kind of little preceding note before a lot of what we say. We say, as a Muslim, quote, as a Muslim. And then we just follow that up with generally statements of personal whim. The statement as a Muslim used to generally precede statements of profound humility and submission. Islam means to submit. So usually when you were declaring as a Muslim, some conclusion, it was related to your complete submission. Whether we're talking about prophetic examples from Sayyidina Ibrahim to Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or talking about something more recent, like Muhammad Ali when he was drafted and told to go fight in a war, illegal and corrupt war, an unethical and immoral war. And he said, there's the laws of Allah and there's the laws of the land. Throw me in jail, right? And he's as a Muslim. That was as a Muslim. I submit to the laws of Allah. And if the laws of the land contradict, then you're just going to have to throw me in jail. So this first step, when we say our goals and our means have to be Islamically based on Islamic values, Islamic hierarchy of priorities, that may seem, it should be not controversial, but it's very important. It can't be overemphasized. It's like a good mission statement. And nowadays, it's all too common to find that people are rushing. All of us find ourselves rushing into political engagement. The 24/7, 365 reality TV show that is politics. We find ourselves rushing into discussions, forming opinions, solidifying our opinions, making commitments, organizing, campaigning, donating, spending our time, whatever it may be. And we do that without first examining our mission statement, our premise, our goals. You don't really see deep down discussions about what are Muslim goals, what are our community's goals, what are our hierarchies of priorities. You see us rushing into the political engagement. And when we do have discussions about Islam and how Islam fits into it, unfortunately, what's become very common is you see Islam coming later. And what we're doing is trying to reverse engineer some justification, some Islamic argument to fit political commitments and ideologies and views and sensibilities that we have committed to and felt deeply and ingrained and adopted. It's kind of like analogous to fatwa shopping. When somebody kind of reaches a conclusion, they really want something specific. They've already committed to it. Their heart's in it. They're completely sold on it, irrespective of Islam. And now their job is to just go find someone who will validate that, right? Or to just make any argument that they can to add a kind of Islamic trapping to it. It comes from that cognitive dissonance. We can't reconcile being completely unconcerned with actual Islamic orthodoxy. And we also can't give up that which we've committed to. So we can't deal with the cognitive dissonance of the disagreement between these two things. So we just reconcile it by reverse engineering Islamic justifications. So if we can get into the goals, right? If we say that the goals of Muslim political engagement has to be centered around Islamically oriented goals, values, priorities, and a hierarchy of priorities, then let's figure out what those goals are, right? We often see, and I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but we often see endless debates where people are talking past each other about certain political strategies or certain political views, and you notice that they're using different metrics, right? One of them is validating their approach or their view, and the other person's validating theirs, and they're talking past each other because the way they're measuring whether or not their view holds up or their strategy holds up is based on different metrics and largely based on different goals. I'm going to come back to this, but I'll preview an example, I thought a very significant example. There was a recent Supreme Court case that was very monumental, if you will. Most Supreme Court cases are pretty important, but Muslims were responsible for competing amicus briefs to the Supreme Court. An amicus brief is a case that a third party submits to the court. So you have a government entity in front of the court, and you have whoever the other party is in front of the court debating a certain law and whether something's legal or not legal or how rights should be defined. An amicus brief is when a third party comes in and the third party says, we have nothing to do with this technically, but we're very interested in this. We have a practical interest in this. And they submit an amicus brief. So there was a Supreme Court case that touched on freedom of religion. And Muslims submitted competing amicus briefs to the Supreme Court, with one being what I would categorize as very pro-religious freedom and protection of the Muslim community's ability to be sovereign in their affairs, and the other against it. And by the way, the one that was against it was by the much larger organization with many more legal scholars and professors and academics. And the point is that when you see them debate each other, it actually became clear through their own rhetoric that their goals were very different. And so they were both making good arguments for their goals. But the question was, whose goal was the proper goal? Whose goal was more Islamically informed? Whose goal conformed to the proper understanding of what our priorities are as Muslims? And so here I submit that as Muslims, our first goal must be the ability to establish our deen fully. Now, I'm not talking just political goals, right? Before we get into political engagement, we have to talk about our goals as a community, as Muslims, as a community. I think even though I submit this as my proposal, obviously I didn't come up with this. I think this is an axiomatic truth. Essentially, this is something by definition is true. As I said, Muslim means to submit to Allah. In the Quran, it says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Allah says about himself, I didn't create jinn and mankind except to worship, right? So he's using that exclusion with emphasis, right? You have no purpose to your creation except to worship. So our first goal as Muslims, to say that we are Muslims, no matter where we are, is to establish our deen, right? And that involves two things. That involves practice and education. The reason being, obviously, that we as humans, not just Muslims, we're nothing more than a series of successive generations. If we cannot teach our religion, practice our religion, and pass it on, and create an environment to pass it on, it's not just in rhetoric. If we cannot educate properly and comprehensively, then no matter how much we practice, that practice will be gone within a generation or two. So I submit that our priority has to be establishment of our deen, and then the ability to give da'wah, then security, and then the betterment of our society. All of these are goals, and they do overlap. Obviously, the ability to give da'wah is tied directly to your security, and the betterment of your society is hand in hand with da'wah. But I'm parsing them out a little bit just to understand where our emphasis is. If we have to choose between two things, even though they usually overlap, if we have to choose between two things, we understand that our ability to establish our deen comes absolutely first. Given that first goal, and then also given our small size in this country, we're 1% of the population, okay? And we're not even a very unified community in America. Being 1% of the population, and in a population or in a nation, and increasingly in a world where the 99% are socially, culturally, ideologically agnostic or atheistic. We live in no longer a kind of Ahmadidat world of Christian and Muslim, and theism is just taken for granted. We live increasingly in a secular, agnostic, atheistic world. Individualism is rampant. Liberal philosophy, lowercase L liberal. For the record, if I say liberal, I generally mean lowercase L liberal, which includes Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, the whole nine. But increasingly also morally liberal views are the 99%. So given that that is what the 99% is, and we're 1%, when we say our first goal must be to establish our deen, that necessarily means that we have to be protecting and establishing our communities, because Islamic Sharia is already communal. But it becomes all the more necessary where you're 1% of a society, and that 99% is quite antagonistic ideologically and in practice to what you're about. It becomes that much more important to establish and protect communities. So our goal to establish our deen necessarily entails establishing and protecting institutions in our community. Now, it's worth noting here that those goals that I mentioned, whether it's establishing our deen, whether it's giving da'wah, whether it's our own security or the betterment of society, any of those goals, it's hard not to notice that most of the work that goes into achieving these goals occurs outside of the political arena. Not just outside of voting, outside of the entire political arena. Most of our goals, the hard work to achieve most of every goal, occurs outside of the political arena. Establishing a community occurs 100% outside the political arena. Maintaining and preserving that community occurs mostly outside the political arena. And this provides us with a very important perspective. As we get into the idea of political engagement, it's very important to remember something, to keep a certain perspective, which is that political engagement is merely a tool. It is something we use to supplement our efforts as a community, right? We have much work to be done to achieve our goals and to continuously work towards those goals. And political engagement is actually a very limited, specific tool that we use to supplement our goals and our community. It's not the other way around. And increasingly what we seem to be seeing, or what I would submit is my observation, is that our schools and masjids, our institutions, our organizations, our community is being repurposed and re-managed and calibrated to feed our political engagement. Our political engagement is becoming our end. It's becoming our actual goal. And all our institutions are being geared towards producing the most possible political engagement for its own sake. This brings me to, I remember there was an interview with, it's a little tangential, but I remember there was an interview with Malcolm X, Allah yarhamu, obviously a long time ago. And the interviewer kind of very simply tried to summarize him and Martin Luther King. And he said, "You're all about segregation." Malcolm X is black separatist, let's say at the time. And Martin Luther King's all about integration. And Malcolm X said, "No, that's not the case." And the reporter was kind of surprised by that, because he was at the time, Pan-African ideology was, the centerpiece of what he was talking about, what they were talking about. And he said, Malcolm X said, "You don't understand how to differentiate the ends from the means." And neither at the time, he said he didn't think Martin Luther King knew how to do that either. He said, "For me, integration or segregation is just a means to an end. The end is equality." And what Malcolm X was saying was, if integration were to lead to equality, then great, I'm all for it. But the reality at the time, possibly right now, is that Black Americans were experimenting with integration with terrible results, right? It wasn't their fault. It's not they didn't want equality. It's just that integration was not resulting in equal dignity for them. And he said, if the option is between integrating and not achieving equality, or segregating and achieving equality, then I'd rather segregate. And I found it was profound that he actually understood, and this is what he was criticizing Martin Luther King on. He said, even if you're pro-integration, don't lose the plot, which is don't sacrifice equality for something that's supposed to just be a means towards it. And nowadays, let's take it back to our Muslim political engagement. By the way, 60 years later, we could probably still just play tapes of Malcolm X, and he could lead our community right now, probably better than most of us can. But if we take it back now to give you an example of this phenomena of political engagement being its own goal, and that's a problem. We have to recalibrate and realize that it's a tool, or else we'll become the tools. How many times do we see people who are Muslims make it onto some political stage, whether as media personalities, politicians, pundits, celebrities, whatever, and then they advocate or push for something explicitly problematic as Muslims. And we find Muslims making the excuse and saying, brother, sister, hey, at least they're on the stage, at least we have somebody who's there. The fact that they made it is the win. And that's really not, that's evidence of what I'm proposing is a problem that we have, which is we're buying into the idea of representation for its own sake. where as Muslims, we are about substance. We're not a culture, we're not an ethnicity. We're not just people who just want somebody who looks like us. When we engage as Muslims, it goes back to our goals. So it may seem obvious that our goals should be Islamic, but if you just look at the rhetoric and how we excuse and how we promote people regardless of their substance because they're Muslim, I think that our political engagement often needs to be recalibrated to focus back on our goals and why we're in it in the first place and what political engagement is supposed to be serving. So even though I'm saying that political engagement is a limited tool and does not have necessarily the ability, even if it works for us, to achieve the goals that we want on its own, it's actually just a minor tool relative to all the actual work we have to do locally. I don't want to downplay. I actually want to emphasize the importance of political engagement, political involvement, and our politics generally. And the reason is because for better or for worse, politics actually shapes our communities, whether we like it or not. And like I said, for better or worse. And on that point, I want to, again, go on a little bit of a tangent. And I promise I'll try to tie it back in. But I was taking a human rights jurisprudence course, several of them, with a professor who I love and respect dearly. And I'm mentioning this because I want to bring up a lesson that he taught and like a metaphor that he brought up that I think is very telling. He was teaching a human rights jurisprudence course, and he was saying, let's put aside whether everybody wanted to discuss whether A or B is a human right or a human rights violation. He said, put aside what's a human rights violation or a human right. He said, put aside even what are human rights. He said, let's go back even further and let's ask, why should we even take human rights seriously? Why should we accept that there's such a thing as human rights, a notion of human rights? And now he was raised Catholic, and he said, look, the answer is easy for people of religion, right? Take the Catholic example, like he was saying. He said, Catholics will say, we're created in God's image, we're the children of God, God-given human dignity. They have a very consistent explanation and justification for human rights. But he said, as a secular, how can we justify human rights? Secular politics is essentially an atheistic, agnostic approach to politics. So he said, without this theistic component, how can we justify human rights, period, let alone begin to define it and defend it? And he cited Nietzsche, who was a famous atheist philosopher who was actually somewhat intellectually honest about it. And Nietzsche said, look, his famous quote is, man is equal before God, because we are nothing but man before God. We are all equal, but God is dead. Astaghfirullah. What he's saying, Nietzsche don't believe God died. Nietzsche doesn't believe in God at all. What he's saying is, now that we've abandoned this notion of God, our equality and our human dignity and everything that underpins morality used to depend on the idea that we were equal before God. But if there is no God, what are we staking our notion of human dignity and equality on? And for Nietzsche, morality was nothing more than weak people trying to convince stronger people not to take advantage of them. Anyway, this is there's a whole discussion to be had about human rights philosophy. That's pretty important. But the point that the professor was making was he proposed a metaphor. And I think that if I can't tell who's on this Zoom meeting because there's all this fancy equipment, but if anybody's on this Zoom meeting who's at least as old as me and remembers the Wile E. Coyote cartoons with the Roadrunner, where basically the Wile E. Coyote is always chasing the Roadrunner, and then he chases the Roadrunner, and the Roadrunner stops, and the Wile E. Coyote runs off the cliff, and he's just suspended in air. He's standing, and there's no cliff underneath him. What the professor proposed is that human rights, actually, the entire political philosophy of human rights rests on religious assumptions, religious premises, religious beliefs about human nature and human purpose and morality, etc. And he says that maybe us secular folks are actually like the Wile E. Coyote. We stepped off the cliff, and we don't realize, we haven't looked down, we don't realize that we only are up there on the basis of these religious premises. That was the cliff. That was the foundation. And we've stepped off of it. So there's actually nothing, no foundation for our claim to human rights. The reason I like that metaphor is because human rights are like any other political question. Human rights is just the area of politics. It rests upon all political conclusions and discussions and debates and positions and philosophies rest on that cliff of general beliefs and philosophy, right? Your idea of your political philosophy is really nothing more than a logical conclusion of your more fundamental beliefs about human nature, purpose, fulfillment, relationships, morality, good and evil, right and wrong. And so just as a secular individual living in a secular world that has largely abandoned religion steadily for the last 400 to 500 years can find himself unwittingly standing on religious premises without even noticing it. What about Muslims who do not examine their political beliefs? Can they not very easily be standing on very liberal, anti-Islamic or secular beliefs, foundations that uphold their political views? When we rush into political engagement and we don't examine our premises, let alone build our own, as we said earlier, build our own understanding of our goals, build our own, establish our own community, know our goals, and then build our own political strategies. When we just jump on into political engagement that's already existing in a secular world by largely secular groups, is it really that far-fetched that we're standing on a foundation that's pretty problematic? And when, if I can add to the professor's metaphor, the Wile E. Coyote never falls until he looks down. When he looks down, it's almost as if when he acknowledges that there's nothing underneath him, he then falls, right? He free falls. And what will happen to us when we look down and we've been politically engaged for so long, adopting these things without thinking, and one generation after the other, it's becoming more normal. We're adopting political goals and premises and ideas and movements without thinking about the beliefs that underpin them. What will happen when we look down, right? Will we find Islam there? I would venture to say no, but there's a quote by Robert George, who's a professor, Christian professor, who says, "It's foolish to suppose that what is embraced in politics will not affect what happens in religion. If Muslims embrace the dogmas of secular progressivism, even for quote unquote tactical reasons, their children will be Muslims in name only, and their grandchildren will not be Muslims at all." And I need to repeat because there's some emphasis on some parts. I think his statement's also very profound. If Muslims embrace the dogmas, right? The dogmas of secular progressivism. So dogma, it's like a religious belief. We often say, you hear too many Muslims say, keep religion out of it. What does religion have to do with anything? Like I said, political philosophy rests on beliefs, whether or not they're theistic, it rests on them. And you're adopting dogmas and religious beliefs that are beyond dispute, first principles. So you can't leave religion out of it. You're just intentionally making yourself ignorant. But if Muslims embrace the dogmas of secular progressivism, even for tactical reasons, their children will be Muslims in name only, and their grandchildren will not be Muslims at all. The Christian community knows about this all too well, as he does. What happens generation over generation when you embrace an underlying dogma? We're not immune, right? Our grandchildren we don't have much effect on them other than what we pass down actively, right? So just the fact that they're born Muslim to Muslim to Muslim, that's not going to have any effect. And they could be just within a generation or two. We're seeing it now. So I think that quote was very instructive. And a note on one of the things he said secular progressivism. For those of you that don't understand what progressivism is, you hear about progressive politics, right? This person's a progressive. We talk about these terms. They're very loaded, right? Progressivism rests on a philosophical belief that human progress is inevitable, that we are constantly evolving, including morality. Our morality is evolving. And so in a word, progressivism is very anti-tradition, right? Muslims, it doesn't take a lot of scholarly understanding of Islam to understand that we are very pro-tradition, right? We don't believe that the further you get away from Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the more enlightened you become. But that is a premise of progressivism, right? It's called the progress narrative, the idea that we're constantly evolving morally. In fact, the big push against liberalism in America today doesn't come from the right. It comes from postmodernists. It's the new strain that kind of makes itself out to be the anti-liberal philosophy. But it's adopted actually by those more on the left. And it's actually defined by the fact that they're very anti-objective truth. They believe in complete moral relativity and no objective truth. And they believe that truly we just evolve morally. And so there's actually a funny, to show you how this has a profound effect and how religion is succumbing to this when there isn't a concerted effort. The Catholic Church itself, the office of the Pope, papacy, I don't know how the official term would be, released a press release or a statement a few years back, changing their position on the death penalty. I talk about human rights and the effect, how that is, there's an important discussion to be had about human rights, because this is an area that's largely a very rich area for soft colonialism. But the Catholic Church came out and said that they are now against the death penalty and will commit themselves to overturning the death penalty as part of a larger human rights effort around the world. And when they had to justify it, because of course, Catholics, the Christian tradition is not anti-death penalty. You just have to read the Bible to understand that. Jesus was not anti-death penalty. In fact, the Catholic theology, if you take it for what it is, Jesus killed himself. God applied the death penalty to his own son, right? So they came out against the death penalty and they defended it by saying that they have a evolved sense of dignity, that their ideas of human dignity have evolved and have, I believe the exact word, I can't remember the exact word about their, how they describe their kind of growth in understanding human dignity. And I was talking to a Catholic professor once about this. And I asked him, what human dignity? He said, God-given human dignity. And so the idea is that God himself, and they believe in God incarnate, right? God is a man. God himself, you've developed an idea of human dignity, of God-given human dignity, that's more evolved and more enlightened than God himself. That doesn't make any sense, right? But this is the kind of pressure that politics eventually puts on political beliefs. When people commit to these political beliefs, again, we talked earlier, you reverse engineer religious arguments, no matter how attenuated they are. So if you look at our society, a liberal society, liberal philosophy, it's based on individualism, individual rights frameworks. And that's just the natural result of what are the beliefs that underpin politics in this society. It's built on the view of the human being as radically autonomous. They're very individual. They're actually, in their state of nature, they're actually just exist almost in a vacuum. They're autonomous. They're separate from everyone else. And their interests are separate from everyone else. And their fulfillment is separate from everyone else. And in fact, other people are actually a hurdle to your fulfillment and your liberation. And it's no wonder, obviously, that our rights frameworks tend to liberate people from their family, from their religion, from their obligations, from their community. Is it any surprise, if the point is that politics has just kind of like that metaphor of the cliff that the coyote was standing on, if politics is just the end conclusion and that the beliefs is what underpin it, if we don't think about those beliefs and we just adopt the politics, we're going to be standing on those beliefs that are assumed, right? They're going to affect us one way or the other. Is it any surprise that in this society where the view of the ability of any given individual by themselves to succeed financially, when that's the measure of freedom, when that's the measure of success, is it any surprise that we got an amicus brief from a Muslim organization and Muslim attorneys and Muslim scholars telling the Supreme Court to curtail the rights of Muslim religious institutions generally in order to benefit people financially as individuals, right? That was essentially the argument in front of the Supreme Court. It was, if we narrow the rights of the private sphere, then any given one individual can more likely succeed economically. If I can explain that, I wasn't planning on explaining this specific issue, but I don't want to do a bad job explaining it. So essentially, before the Supreme Court, there was a case, and there was a Christian baker. Maybe people know about this, and he had refused to participate in baking a cake for a gay wedding or homosexual wedding, and it got kicked to the Supreme Court. And the idea was, does he have to participate as a private entity in this kind of celebration? And to be clear, he wasn't against selling a cake. He just didn't want to specifically make a wedding cake that specifically celebrated the idea of homosexual relations. That's against his creed. He said that's a big sin to partake in that and to celebrate it and to condone it. So the reality that we have is that a pretty quick summary of legal jurisprudence. In America, you have equal protection and you have religious freedom. And the reason I'm mentioning this is, I know we're talking about political engagement, but it helps to have a little information about the politics that you're engaging in. We often get a lot of people who discuss politics and don't understand the actual political reality. So we have equal protection and religious freedom. Religious freedom essentially provides some autonomy and protects the private sphere. In America, you have the private sphere and the public sphere. The public sphere, the government can dictate. Private sphere, they cannot. The exception to this is equal protection. So easy example, even if you're a private business, if you want to discriminate against Black folks just for being Black, you can't do it, even though you're a private business. The government can pierce the private sphere and dictate that, hold you accountable, can fine you, can put you out of business. So we agree with that. We think that racial discrimination shouldn't be tolerated. Currently, there's a movement to expand equal protection to include actions and not just racial identity, such that the private sphere gets shrunk so much that within a private sphere, like a religious organization, private organization, a masjid, a school, you cannot dictate what actions are okay to partake in and to support and to condone and what aren't. And so certain Muslim group, a large, very large Muslim group of legal scholars and professionals wrote an amicus brief saying, yes, what you need to do is force that Christian baker to partake in these specific celebrations. And you need to make it a law or make it allowed, to limit the ability of private institutions to discern, right? To discriminate, if you will. And when they try to defend it, they defend it on the basis of, well, if I'm a Muslim businessman, what's going to maximize my potential clientele? If no one can ever refuse me service, then that would be best for me as an individual. And so, I feel like I've taken a long time to try to explain a point and I've strayed from the point, but the point was to say that our political philosophy will affect our beliefs and our value hierarchies and how we approach our foundation. And so it's no surprise that in this country now you have Muslims who are, if you go back to our goals, they are not prioritizing the establishment of their deen. They're not willing to accept that there is this possibility that they may be themselves discriminated against, or somebody may not want to do business with them. It's all about maximizing our assimilation and our comfort in this country, even if it means actively taking part in minimizing our legal protections to establish our community and our institutions, which I submitted is our primary goal and is essential to our goal of being Muslims in a country where we're 1% of the population. It's also no surprise that where liberal values are basically the only religion you can have and religion you can put in politics, we have a person who is on every Muslim speaker circuit, conference, religious, political, legal. And this person is somebody who openly promotes the Constitution as his Sharia and says there's no such thing as Islamic Sharia, right? This is a person I don't mind naming because I think he's a particular example. And this is Khizr Khan. He's probably going to show up in this election cycle as well because he's basically the token brown Muslim who is the acceptably integrated Muslim, right? And he's showed up at a key speaker at a conference called Reviving the Islamic Spirit. And he's on record saying on national television, there's no such thing as Sharia. There's only the Constitution, right? So that these things are not a surprise. These things come from goalless, foundationless political engagement that it ends up molding our actual beliefs as opposed to the other way around. So if we can get to, and I'll try to, wrap up with this area. So if we're going to talk about, okay, we know we need to have our goals be Islamically oriented, and we know that politics is just a tool, a small tool. So now we have to know about what the political reality is around us. We often hear about the lesser of two evils, right? This is what the presentation is originally going to be about, and it could be its own discussion. So what we have to understand just very basically that there are some differences between the two parties, if you will, the left, the right, whatever it may be. It needs to be understood, and again, its own topic. Both the right and the left, libertarians, democratic socialists, they're all lowercase l liberal in terms of their philosophy. So their underlying beliefs are very liberal. America's liberal project. So there's a lot that they have in common. What they disagree on is often much smaller than people think philosophically. In action, they're not that different as well. Now, there are certain differences for sure, definitely in rhetoric, but in action, there's much more overlap than there is distinction, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy. The rhetoric is very different. I will submit that I believe the right is anti-Muslim, anti-Islam and anti-Muslim. I personally believe that the left is pro-Muslim but anti-Islam. I think the right assumes we are more religious than we are. They assume that the average Muslim is actually a pretty profound follower of Islam, and they have a serious philosophical problem with Islam. The left has just as much of a philosophical problem with Islam, maybe even more, because the right has a certain religious conservatism to it, some strains of it. But the left feels that Muslims aren't, we're the exception, we're different, right? So they believe in a kind of neutered, modern progressive Islam. So talking about the lesser of two evils, I just want to jump into that because there's, we can go on about the right and the left, but talking about the lesser of two evils, I submit three things, right? The first is that the reality is Muslims are no longer engaged in a lesser of two evils analysis. A lesser of two evils analysis in Islam is something you begrudgingly, reluctantly drag your feet to have to do because you're dealing with two serious evils and you are forced, it's out of necessity, right? In Islam, you don't, go to the bar and say it's better than the strip club. that you have a choice not to go to either, right? It's something where it's out of necessity. There's serious harm that's coming, and you have to accept a certain evil just to avoid another evil. What we have today is not that at all. Just look around. 2000, the year 2000, for those who are a little older, easily remember it. For those who may be a little younger, may not. I'm kind of in that middle age group. In the year 2000, for better or worse, people were dragging their feet to vote for Bush. And the Muslims actually won the election for him. And people felt, for one reason or another, that he would be better than Gore. And the very fact they were voting Republican itself is, indicative of that. But you could really remember people struggling with this decision. No one was advertising it. Nobody was, celebrating it. At least most people weren't. And now if you look over just the last 20 years, what's happened? Muslims have become the willing and excited face of the Democratic Party. We campaign, we donate, we spend our time, we take jobs, we volunteer. We're willing to do the work for free. We can't find time to do anything, whether it's an Islamic obligation or not. But we find plenty of time to commit to campaigning, supporting, discussing, all kinds. And our hearts and our minds are with these parties and these platforms and these personalities. So it's not a lesser evil analysis at all. I would submit that it's not a lesser evil analysis at all. You've just adopted one side. And in fact, I think that's some proof to the effect that political engagement without a foundation has an effect on you that you don't realize, especially one generation after another. You start realizing that those parents who voted for Bush, who did not do a good job of developing a political strategy, have kids now who are all too excited. When we voted for Bush, what was the main rhetoric? It was that Al Gore had a openly Zionist VP, and that if that guy got in the White House, Muslims would be in trouble, especially Muslims in Palestine. It was a good sensibility, right? It was a wrong calculation, but it came from a good place. Now you have Joe Biden, who isn't just an avowed Zionist. Joe Biden once said publicly, I believe on the floor of Congress, that if there wasn't an Israel, if Israel didn't exist, we would create an Israel so that we can serve its interests. He actually said this when he was disgusted with the fact that they'd even discuss their allegiance and their support of Israel. And now you have people lined up to support him, right? Heck, 12 years ago, he was the VP for Obama. 8 years after, Gore had a Zionist VP, and they were lined up to support him then. So first thing I submit is that we're not even dealing with lesser of two evils analysis anymore, and that's very problematic. The second thing I submit is that even if we were applying the lesser of two evils, it's not very clear that either side is a lesser evil, okay? Even if we're going to say, okay, a lot of people aren't applying lesser of two evils. They're actually bought and sold, or they're part and parcel of this. And they have their hopes and their hearts in this, as opposed to they're reluctant about it. Even if we applied it, it's not clear. There's an argument to be made that it's not clear at all who the lesser of two evils is. For one, and it's very, very important, what we just talked about, the fact you cannot say, right? An educated person can say, yeah, I get that all these youth and all these personalities and all these pundits and all these activists and even some of these scholars and all of these organizations, they drank the Kool-Aid and they're all basically towing the party line, and it's no longer a lesser evil analysis for them. But I am still applying a lesser evil analysis. First of all, I don't think you can do that, because part of the evil to be measured is the effect on the Muslim community. The effect on the Muslim community of our current political engagement, and specifically of our engagement with the left. Let's be honest. It's not like we're very much engaging with the right. Our engagement with the left has left a lot of our institutions in their service, and more alarmingly, aligned with them belief-wise, right? And so that's not an evil we can ignore. We can't simply say, well, let's put all that aside and let's just assess academically policy, because the effect it has on society and on the Muslim community is perhaps more important than any policy, especially when we talked about our goals being the preservation of our community and establishment of our deen. That has a direct effect on the establishment of our deen, right? The Christians have seen it. Jewish communities increasingly seeing it, and the Muslim community sees it, that the left's politics have a much more pervasive social effect between those 4 years on our communities and our youth than any policy does or any election does every 4 years. Aside from that, we had what I briefly discussed and probably didn't do a very good job of, but it's probably a topic for a different day, the idea that politically and legally, the protection of the private sphere is probably the most correlated with Muslim political interests. And the left is actually not for protection of the private sphere. They're actually much more about limiting the private sphere and religious freedom. And then lastly, you have the Malcolm X argument of the wolf and the fox, the preference for the wolf, knowing your enemy is your enemy versus having a friend who is actually an enemy, a supposed friend who's an enemy. The idea that the right is pretty clear about their antagonism towards us, and there's no mistaking where we differ, and there's no pitfalls that we can fall into with association. We can pick and choose exactly when and where and how we associate with them on what terms. Whereas on the left, we don't have that. And so those three things alone, I believe, obviously you can expound on each one of those things, the effect that the left has had on our society, the politics of the left themselves from a legal perspective and a political perspective and a jurisprudence perspective, and then the obvious, wolf versus fox philosophy. Those provide a good argument for how the left isn't the lesser of two evils, right? So again, I don't think lesser of evils is even what we're doing, but if we were doing it, I'm not so sure that the left is the lesser evil. Personally, I don't think they are. I don't think there is a lesser evil in these two. And that brings me to my third point. Even if you don't agree that we're not doing a lesser of evil analysis, or that if we did a lesser of evil analysis, Islamically, one is better than the other. Putting aside those two, I submit that the lesser of two evil analysis doesn't even apply to U.S. national politics, right? What more applies to U.S. national politics, or what applies better is a race to the bottom. What has happened is, given our two-party system, the reality of a two-party system, and the political interests that are present, both parties actually push the lesser of two evils rhetoric, right? You just look back at the last election. Donald Trump's entire campaign was a lesser of two evils thing. Yeah, you say I'm this, but Hillary's worse. Yeah, I'm corrupt, but she's a criminal. Yeah, I disrespect women, but she abused women. And her husband, abused women. And so it was all a lesser of two evils analysis. If you look at the right, how did they justify whenever, Trump was maligned, rightfully maligned? They would say, well, what about Hillary? And it's just not just about what about. They made a good case. She had a 30-year record, her and her husband, of being quite evil, right? And so what happens is, when both sides are using lesser of two evils, and they're only real players in the game, both sides are assured that they're not, as long as they're a lesser evil than the other side, they're going to be fine. And so what we end up having is constantly a devolving state of our politics. We're actually entrenching the fact that this is a race to the bottom, because each side is not only employing the lesser of two evils analysis, but by their own metrics, by their own standards, if you look at each side, they have measurably gotten worse in their policies, in their politics, even in their rhetoric, right? Both of them by their own standards. And they're allowed to do that because we keep saying lesser of two evils. We're actually, by constantly approaching it in that way, we're actually entrenching the fact that, and incentivizing them to be able to continue to push whatever actual agendas are being pushed at our expense without any kind of repercussion, political repercussion for them. Now, the thing is, this realization it's not just my realization. It's increasingly present in growing circles of young, politically like astute or active or involved Americans, especially ones with radical political views, socialists, libertarians, and when they have postmodernist kind of philosophy behind them. They're starting to realize that this is really a race to the bottom, and they're becoming disenchanted with it. Less and less people want to vote, and more people are seeing this as over time. Like we said, 2020, you can see a stark difference. But now in very real time, you're noticing individuals, not just parties, within a same election cycle, within the same whatever, people radically change and just get worse because they're guaranteed the lesser of two evils thing. We just had, obviously, I don't want to just talk current politics, but we just had the VP nomination. This is a woman who, when she was debating Biden, literally described him without naming him. She described an old, racist, rich individual who was repressive and against the Black community and all this kind of stuff. And then she said, and it's not Donald Trump, it's Joe Biden. She basically did a long description of what people think Donald Trump is. And then she said, and it's actually Joe Biden. And now I'm honored to be on his campaign. And you have political pundits who went from saying, these are the only two people I would not support, to saying we're honored and this is historic and whatever it may be. So the clear conclusion to take away from that is that so long as we're saying lesser of two evils, anything goes, because all you have to do is say you're less evil than the other party. And so parties are no longer incentivized to do anything other than serve those interests that are much more lucrative to them. And so what my concern is that I have actually started to see many young Muslims realize this and voice this, but for all the wrong reasons. Usually, almost without exception, all the younger Muslims that I've seen reach this conclusion and finally have that, as opposed to the last 3 elections or so, finally have this, you know what, this lesser of two evils isn't really the case. It's actually a race to the bottom. Their views are very radical leftist politics. And it's amazing that, for me, that means that these folks are more committed to their views than we are to ours. And these are people who don't even believe in morality, but are more morally principled than we are. I said a lot of these folks don't actually believe in objective truth. The progressive kind of postmodernist doesn't believe in objective truth. And yet they're more honest. People who don't believe in truth are more honest about their analysis than we are. And so it's not that heartening to see that people are reaching certain conclusions, but it's only making clear that our politics are really having our political engagement that's without proper foundation is having an undesired effect on us. And I go back to Robert George's quote, within a couple of generations, I think this kind of political engagement can have disastrous effects. I want to stop. I want to wrap up here. I had a few more things, but I want to stop. I feel like I've talked too much. But in summary, I think we need to establish our goals according to Islam. First, we have to establish what our goals are, have an agreement on them, have an agreement on what it means to be involved as Muslims. And then from there, we need to strategize regarding political engagement, but keep in perspective that it is a tool to achieving our goals, which are largely non-political goals. They're wrapped up in politics because then, politics, political discourse is about everything, but it's in establishing our community, establishing our faith. And then be very wary. Just because it's a limited tool does not mean that it doesn't have a profound effect on us. And so even where we cannot make a difference on a political outcome, the positions we take, especially on issues that we cannot affect the political outcome, are very important, because our political stances, spoken and unspoken, reverberate backwards, right? They will necessarily mold our beliefs, and they will be passed on from one generation to the next, right? The younger generation, each generation is seeing our political activism. They're seeing what we're saying, they're hearing what we're saying, they're noticing what we're not saying, and they're whatever we take on, whatever political engagement we take on, we may be able to be like that Wile E. Coyote who's suspended, who understands, who just walked off the cliff. But with each subsequent generation that just molds after our political engagement, they can't lie to themselves, right? They're going to realize that there's only one foundation that can uphold this. If we're going to adopt this political engagement, what comes with it is all the underlying beliefs. And so we must be very wary, not just of what we can accomplish with our politics, but what our politics says about us and how it shapes us and how it shapes each successive generation. And I'm going to stop there. And if I said anything that's of any use or anything that's correct, it's from Allah. And obviously the many things that I may have said that were mistakes are my own.
Jazakumullah khair, Mouhannad. So we'll open the floor for questions and comments now. If anyone wants to, either you can post a question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and do so. So I'll give some time right now for anyone who wants to ask a question. Feel free to do so at the moment.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa barakatuh.
Yes, I have a question. I didn't hear the whole of the lecture, but so I came in on the end of it. But what it seems to me is that it's sort of ambiguous as far as people in voting. This election that's coming up in November, and it seems like you're saying that either way you vote, it doesn't make a difference. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is, first of all, I purposely did not make this discussion about voting because I think voting is an end. It's an end conclusion. We're not really addressing our political engagement more generally. People can vote for different reasons, and some people are voting, and when they vote, they're voting with a very ideological bend toward what they're voting for, and others are voting quite reluctantly. And I have my own view. Personally, I don't vote in the national election. I don't think that either group is a lesser of two evil. And I do think that there are serious dangers to aligning with just general leftist politics, but also to accepting this lesser evils idea as applied to national politics. I don't believe personally that on the national level, the lesser evil analysis works. That doesn't mean that the two parties aren't distinct in some things, but I don't think that on the whole, the lesser evil analysis works. I think they're both regressing and being enabled by the lesser evil analysis. But I didn't want to make this about voting because, again, people just want to say, they might make the discussion, can we vote or can't we vote? Or must we vote or must we not vote? It becomes, is it halal or haram? Now the discussion is it wajib? I don't think anyone can say it's wajib. And I'm not a scholar. I'm not going to say whether it's halal, haram, or allowed or not allowed. My personal view is that, no, I don't think voting for one side matters. But the reason is beyond just your vote, right? I think a lot goes into, we say we're just voting, but what has happened? Our concern as Muslims should be what is happening in our community with their political involvement. And we've been told it's just voting, we're just going, I think the lesser of two evils argument, essentially, to wrap up my answer, which has gone on too long, but the lesser of two evils argument is almost used as a cop-out. We have a lot of people pushing substantive belief in underlying platforms and policies, etc., not examining these things, ignoring very problematic issues. But when they're held to task about it, they say lesser of two evils, right? I don't believe it's a lesser of two evil. I'm not going to tell people whether they should or shouldn't vote. It's up to them, because at the end of the day, if you disagree and you really are doing it reluctantly and you think it's lesser evil, perhaps we've just reached different conclusions. But I think that the important thing is where it's coming from.
Well, yes, I saw my to continue. I don't. I'm not talking about the lesser of two evils because I don't deal in that. I'm saying that in reality, there is an election that's coming up in November,
Right.
and there are issues that's on the table
Right.
that because whatever happened, whoever party is in there, we as Muslims in this society are going to be affected, and
Yes.
whether we vote or not, we are going to be affected by what is coming up with with this election. So in voting, and I'm not a scholar either, but I believe that Prophet Muhammad SAW would say that we need to, if we're in the society, that we need to participate in that society, because the only way that we're going to make that society better is by our participation in it and us changing what it is. So I'm not saying whether, I would never tell somebody not to vote, because if you don't vote, then whoever gets in there, you're still affected by the person that comes in. So you need to be active and you need to take part in your society, because you need to be in charge of what's going on in that society. And the only way you do that is put your foot in the door and open it and move and get in there and get involved.
I get what you're saying, sister. And I'm going to deflect in a second if Brother Shrah will let me just say something, and then I'll deflect to him and Hassan and Dr. Rami, because I want to answer that, but I also defer to people who are much more religiously knowledgeable than I am. I did not say, and I do not maintain, that we should not be involved. We should be incredibly involved. I spoke about, and I often lean on this example because it's easy. It's not the only example, but I feel like it's great examples are just that, they're great examples. The ultimate example is Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and I'll get to him in a second. But I don't believe people think that Malcolm X was not highly involved in his society, but he was not somebody who turned to voting. He was actually quite opposed to these both parties. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was involved in society. But if we actually were to look at the example of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and I'm not here to make my own kind of exegesis of his life, of the Sira, but if you were to look at Prophet Muhammad's involvement in the 13 years of Mecca, where they were the minority in the society, the involvement, I know you said you missed some of the lecture, but at the beginning of what I said, the goals of Muslims, which include the betterment of society, which is one of our pivotal goals, is largely achieved through non-political means. And Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was not one to compromise his deen in order to better society, because as a Muslim, it is, that's a paradox. To compromise your deen to better society, you're not bettering your society by compromising your deen. The Prophet ﷺ was actually offered before Medina, before they went to Yathrib, before they established their state, when the Muslims were being starved, when the Muslims were being tortured and murdered in broad daylight, sanctioned throughout Mecca, facing trials that we couldn't even imagine as Muslims in America. I mean, let's be honest, Muslims in America are very worried about themselves, and they're probably living the most comfortably out of all Muslims in the world affected by America. So when the Prophet was going through that, he actually was, for example, he was offered political alliances for protection by other tribes that he turned down, because when they had certain conditions about after his death, would they be inherent leadership? And he said he saw that what their goal wasn't proper, or that he wanted his political alliances were very principled. And so the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is actually, and his story is actually very instrumental to how do you approach being a minority in a society that, like you said, it's going to affect us, and there are serious consequences. Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ, you could say everything you want to say about Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ. There is no valid analysis that says that the comfort and the physical well-being of the Muslims were his priority in Mecca. It was the establishment of his deen, and he understood. He didn't try. We're not people who take the difficult road on purpose, right? We actually are told, out of all the valid options, take the easiest. But it's understood that valid options are circumscribed by that which will not compromise our deen. And when we talk about, voting or whatever it may be, there are serious consequences to our political engagement. And for one, on a practical level, we can get a whole different discussion on voting and what those actual consequences are for one administration, Democratic versus Republican, or Democrat versus Republican. There's actually quite an argument to be made that you can't really tell all the differences, and our history tells us they're not all that different. But I think there are other consequences to this involvement, and they're not worth the price. And so, yes, I agree with you. We have to be very involved, and we're not as involved. But to say that voting is our involvement, I think is problematic. And again, I often hear doublespeak. I hear people who, I'm not saying you, but people who defend voting defend it as so crucial. You see so much Muslim effort into voter drives. We have to vote. Get out the vote. You got to vote. The old vote or die that celebrities used to be a part of. Vote or die. It's just about we have to vote. Well, first of all, what if you vote Republican? Oh, no, not that way. So you have to vote Democrat is what people are saying. Okay, so you have to make an argument. That's true of us. When we start showing all of the things that are problematic with voting Democrat, all of the uniquely problematic things about voting Democrat, well, it doesn't solve everything, and it's just one small part, and there's so much other work to do. Okay, so it can't be both. It can't be this pivotal, essential, irreplaceable, gargantuan thing that we spend all our time and effort and stress on. But whenever we're held to task as to what does this actually imply and what are the results of it, we say, it's just a vote, but the real effort is outside of voting. I agree that the real effort is outside of voting. I see the arguments for voting as being very conclusory. They're just conclusory statements. It's important. It's going to affect us. We have to do it. But I don't see a reasoned explanation for why that is. And that's my take.
Are you saying that if you vote, if Muslims vote, they are compromising their deen?
I'm not saying that categorically. What I'm saying is the reality is many Muslims today are voting not out of a lesser of two evils analysis, and even some of those who are compromising the metrics of what is evil and what isn't evil and what we should be accountable for. I do believe that at some point, two administrations and two parties that push mass murder, that push mass exploitation of tens of millions of people, okay, I do believe that people who push oppression on a global scale unheard of before don't get to talk about small differences and lesser of two evils. And I do believe that Muslims who look out for their interest here as 1% of the population here, and maybe a fraction of a percent of the global Muslim population, who talk in terms of the incidental differences between the two and how it would benefit us, and are able to overlook what I think are red lines that both parties cross, domestically and abroad, because people are going to say, Mouhannad, this is all foreign policy, and they're both the same foreign policy. But it's not all foreign policy, right? We do have disastrous foreign policy from both of them. We have disastrous domestic policy from both of them. Under the last 8 years with Barack Obama, he out-deported the entire 20th century. Every civil liberties expert will tell you that in the modern era, he curtailed civil liberties more than any other president. He out-armed the police with military weapons more than any president before him. In a single year, he gave police $500 million of military weapons. He militarized the police. I mean, he bailed out all the Wall Street banks and the financial institutions. He expanded executive power at an unheard of clip. He started a civilian kill list. He killed actual American citizens without trial, without anything, through executive fiat. He expanded drone wars into 7 countries while he had a Nobel Peace Prize. His representative, after he killed a 13-year-old Muslim American citizen boy, whose father he had killed previously, his representative said he should have picked a better dad. And the previous Democratic president had a Secretary of State who, when she was asked on national television about killing 500,000 children under the age of 5 in Iraq between the 2 Iraq wars, she said it was worth it. when we talk about lesser of two evils, and when we talk about are we condoning this? Yes, I think Muslims who are going to talk about how important it is to vote and how consequential it is. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say it's incredibly consequential and it's incredibly important because of all of these differences, but it's we should be completely unaccountable for the things that it does bring about. Just because there will be a president of the United States and there will be a certain administration and a certain party that will do certain things, doesn't mean we have to be a party to it. And if the example of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam proves anything, it's that. If the example of all of the prophets, most prophets didn't have many followers and didn't win. If we judge prophets on their ability to circumvent the political realities of their time, they would mostly fail, right? Their stories would be mostly stories of failure, of how they were able to mitigate harm that was coming from largely Muslim societies, governments, nations. We would consider them failures if that was our metric. So I don't think that should be our metric. And I think we're very loose with this lesser of two evils analysis. And even where we are very self-interested, we might not be that well informed. I think that Malcolm X was on the nose when he said that the wolf is leading us to the fox. And 60 years later, he seems almost prophetic with it, because even when we do this lesser of two evils analysis, we're often just pointing at a fox and somehow not recognizing it as having the same agenda as a wolf. And I think, again, I can keep going on and on about examples and the politics and the policies, but that's my take.
Can we,
Brother Mouhannad, this is, I got a question for you, if that's okay.
Wait, go ahead. Can we ask, there was a question in the box, and then I'm going to get to yours, Brother Ali. Is that one?
But can we also, if Brother Shirah or Dr. Rami have anything to say, and then also if they want to say something while I'm talking, just tell me to shut up and then jump in.
No. So I'm going to ask a question, and then I'm going to have Dr. Rami, Brother Shirah. So this is a question that's been asked probably multiple times. Is about what are some suggestions or advice? How do we get involved? What is the involvement you're talking about? How do we get involved? So I'll have Dr. Rami go, then Imam Sharah, and then back to you, Mouhannad.
Jazakallah khair. I'm going to somewhat, not dodge that question, but I wanted to definitely point out on some of the stuff that in the last exchange between Brother Mouhannad and the sister. First, Brother Mouhannad, Jazakallah khair 1,000 times. I think I will tell you unequivocally, I think, when you stare at something, but you don't recognize it for what it is, Jazakallah khair, I think you definitely have clarified some very, very important points, kind of keeping your eye on the prize. I think some of the sisters' frustration, I can't speak for her, but I think some of the sisters' frustration is the need to improve our situation. But I think if she goes back and inshallah and watches the video from the beginning, she'll see how Brother Mouhannad was mentioning the importance of the methods, not just the goal. The goal's important, but the methods we use for them as well.
I just have to stop you there, brother. I'm not frustrated. I was just asking a question. I'm not frustrated at all because I know what my decision is. I'm not frustrated.
Okay.
No, I appreciate your question, by the way. Thank you very much. And there's more to discuss, but yeah, go ahead.
I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm saying that we all feel impassioned. Okay, maybe that was a better word. Impassioned that we have an opportunity to do something, and what are we going to do about it? So I apologize if I mischaracterized it. But I think, for example, Mouhannad was mentioning about the opportunities for the Rasul to get protection from the different tribes. There's another tribe, and I'm sorry, I forget the tribe, that had offered the Rasul protection. And they said, we will absolutely protect you from the Arabs. But when it comes to the Persians, we can't offer you any protection.
Right. And
the Rasul said, what? It's either everything or none, all or none. Right. And on the other end, you can say about the Hifd al-Fudul, the pre, I don't like the word Islamic because Islam has been here forever, the pre-revelation treaty that the Rasul came with for social justice. The difficulty I think we have, and I think Brother Mouhannad's saying this, but maybe if I can just paraphrase it, we are not voting on single issues anymore. We're basically, by voting, we are, whether actively or passively, but we are saying we believe in this party's ideals or their vision. And therein lies, I think, the difficulty or the danger. Versus, for example, it'd be easy. I think he would agree with me 1,000%. If we threw up individual ideas, national voting opportunity, do you guys want nationalized healthcare? Yes or no? Do you want abortion? Yes or no? Do you want homosexual rights? Yes or no? Do you want individual things? So it's clean cut and we can say we're voting on something in a halal fashion or haram fashion. But that's not what happens. And to be very specific, he mentioned it. Malcolm X, I remember, a couple months ago, like he says, it's one of those lectures I love to listen to. Even when he was in the Nation of Islam, a lot of his political analysis is right on the nose. And he would tell you, I warn you of the so-called liberal. That's the term he used, so-called liberal, a wolf in sheep's clothing. He would use that a lot of times. And the reason why is, I think, as he mentioned, you meet most Republicans, and this is such a generalization, but, the average, Republican, very conservative, kind of like Muslims or how we should be, only if you look like them. They don't extend those rights and beliefs to the non typical looking white person. The Democrats or the even the progressives, the danger is, like you said, it's a social constructionism where the reality changes, or what is real becomes an evolving thing depending on what people want. And it's such a dangerous anti-Islamic dogma that we're fighting. If I wanted to mention the point that I think he was mentioning as well, we are voting or being active or participating, whatever you want to call it, because we are Muslim for Islam. There is no democracy in Islam. There's democratic ideals that democracy stole from Islam. There's a shura that they stole from Islam. There's illegal search and seizure that they stole from Islam. There's a privacy in your home that they stole from Islam. But we do not adopt a secular mentality or a secular ideal. That this is a totally different point. We're trying to jump into the system that believes that, hey, put God somewhere else and let's just go with the politics. And somehow we're trying to say, but we're going to move those two together and we'll work together. Their basic fundamental idea, the purpose of why they're doing things, how they're trying to do things, their goals or where they're going with are so fundamentally against Islam. I'm not saying that, just sit back on your hands and do nothing. No. That's not what I'm saying. But as Brother Mouhannad was spending, the past hour mentioning, is it's not so clear cut and dry because our aqidah is different, our intention is different, our goals are different, and the methodology has to be different. And the difficulty, I think, is that we all, we don't agree, but a lot of us agree on what the goal should be, and then we have difficulty reaching the goal, and so we try and start making compromises in how to reach that goal. I actually was going to ask Brother Mouhannad about this. I was curious what his thoughts were, because I think this was alluding to, he's saying most of the success you're going to get is not on the national stage. I'm assuming his point is on the local level. And I don't know enough about this, but from what I gather, I remember Malcolm X, or I like to say, Hajj Malik Shabaz's whole point was own your own stores, own your own neighborhoods, own your own local politics, run your communities, etc. And I'm guessing that's what he's alluding to, but I want to hear from him what his thoughts were. Is that what he meant, that most of these major changes aren't really on the national stage or on the local level, and that's what's important? And I tend to agree that, okay, so we vote. I look at it both ways, and I'm like, I vote when I feel like my vote is actually, I think, going to change something for the better. And there have been one or two times in, since I've been a kid where I thought maybe my vote might have been something that might have been a lesser of two evils, even though I probably didn't jump in with it. But nowadays, as you mentioned, you're either going to get bombed from these guys, or you can get bombed from these guys. You're going to get attacked to your face and told that you're a horrible person from these guys, or they'll smile at you like Obama said. I am so thank you, Jazakallah khair again for saying it, because the liberal media loves Obama so much that we don't even know what he was doing to our own community. We don't even see the disaster he caused by doing this. Just if I had to point out on this, the first American Muslim citizen that was murdered that he referenced was a Muslim. The first American Muslim, without a trial, without an arrest, without anything, was a Muslim, and a child also as well. I was Muslim, just to keep things in perspective. So
before I answer the question about local, I think Brother Shirah also.
Yeah, can we?
If Shirah wants to answer.
Yeah, go ahead. But then should I unmute yourself?
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
Yeah, my interest was not so much in answering that question, because I think that's a whole nother lecture in and of itself. But what I would like to know in these last few moments, if Brother Mouhannad could give us some kind of idea about what would be some takeaway items to establish, foundation needed to support our religious interests.
Yes, sir. So just a couple of things, right? To answer that question, I'll wrap up with that question. But to Dr. Rami's point, what I was saying, I think sometimes we just lazily say, not national, but let's go local. Local politics can often be the same. What I was saying is that I don't think lesser of two evils applies anymore nationally. I don't think there's any good argument that's backed up by, or I think a better argument that's more backed up by evidence is that on the national level, it's not a lesser of two evils. On the local level, it could still be, and in some places you can actually get good results, but that's not a blanket statement either. Local politics is the breeding ground for national politics. And so I think we have to be careful with blanket statements. I think the same approach applies. We have to have the exact same approach. What are our goals as a community? And we'll get to Brother Shah's question with this. What are our goals and how do we best achieve them? It may be that on the local level, there's some candidate in some specific race, school board race, something that whose philosophies and interests, et cetera, align with ours, and it would not be a compromise. But that doesn't mean just, all right, let's just jump into local politics, just generally cleaner than national politics. It could be very dirty in local politics too, and much of the same problems. And obviously people actually on the local level are trying to get to the national level. There's a lot to prove. It's the same parties. So you have much of the same issues. But I think on a national level, it's just lesser of two evils is just out of the, for me, it's out of the equation. Also, I want to add for what the sister had said, and I'm sorry, I did not catch her name, to piggyback on what Dr. Ami was saying, but to add, it isn't just, sometimes we get mischaracterized as being like, oh, we have a simpleton argument. Oh, these two people are both bombing. First of all, it's problematic that people think that's a simple argument when we're talking about millions of people suffering, bleeding, dying, being displaced. But even, because people will say, well, that's a national one. But even domestic policy, immigration, police reform, domestic surveillance, healthcare, all of these things, people are hard pressed to find education, right? For example, right here locally, we have a charter school, and most Muslim and religious groups and minorities who their analysis, if you want to do a secular analysis outside of religion, would benefit from the charter school system, right? Taking schools in your own hands. That's a very Republican project. I'm not a fan of Republicans. I'll never vote Republican, but Democrats are quite against that, right? Like I said, freedom of religion, expansion of the private sphere. Democrats are very against that. They're very pro-surveillance. They're very pro-militarized police in terms of their policies. And then if we can add to that, when people just assume they know, I think we have to be humble about what we know and what we don't know. In the year 2000, when we voted for Bush, what did he campaign on? George Bush, before him, Clinton campaigned on a very typical Democratic platform. And what did he end up being? Even though we remember him for a good economy, he was a butcher overseas, and he established much of the precedent for the terrible immigration policies that we have and a lot of the crime bills that ended up severely devastating the black community, even though they were part of his most loyal base. George Bush ran on a platform that was very anti-imperial. George Bush got on national television and said, we need to stop being the people who police the world. His opponent's VP was an ardent Zionist. He was a Christian, he was this, he was that. He said a lot of things that we would agree with. And then he turned out to architect the Iraq War, and enter Afghanistan. And we know the disaster that came about from Bush. Barack Obama, we don't have to introduce what he was. First of all, the obvious, he's a very handsome, eloquent, educated, well-rounded individual. And so he's able to convince very well. But he ran, obviously, the first black president. His middle name's Hussein. He was raised in Indonesia. Who would have thought that he would curtail civil liberties more than anyone, arm the police more than anyone? A Nobel Peace Prize winner would expand the drone project in Africa, of all places, in an incredible way, would attack 7 Muslim countries without the authorization of Congress, would expand executive power and hand Donald Trump much of the executive power has. If people actually follow, and I don't suppose anybody should give me any credit for any kind of authoritative opinion on anything. But for this purpose, I will mention I am a lawyer. And if you study the Supreme Court opinions that support Trump's ridiculous policies, they're often rooted in the Supreme Court saying, we gave Obama this power. And so it would be a contradiction. There's precedent that we set under Obama that allows Trump to do what he's doing. And, everything from the stories about when it came out that you have the kids in cages, which is disastrous, all those largely Hispanic kids in cages under Trump, but the cages were built and purposed under Obama, right? The $100 billion deal Trump signed with Saudi was actually a $90 billion deal with Obama just being represented, right? So there's all kinds of, we don't know what these people are going to do. We do have a history that their policies are generally in a certain line, and their rhetoric is generally matters not, right? Domestic or foreign policy, financial, civil rights, whatever. So just to get to Brother Shirah's question, I'll wrap it up. Brother Shirah's asking what? Can
I take another question real quick, because and then we can from the brother, he's been waiting for a while, and then we can.
Sure. I will wrap up with Brother Shirah's later.
Brother Ali Khan, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers. Assalamu alaikum, brother Mouhannad. Thank you, and I agree with the thesis point of your argument that we need to have a foundation and the goals to before we approach this engagement. Otherwise, there's some severe risks there.
Yes,
now,
sir.
I want to get your input on the diversity of the American Islamic community. And we can look at this many ways religiously, right? We have a good number, the majority will be Sunni. We have a good number of Shias, and they'll take, some conflict with what they hear from Sistani or Khamenei about not trusting the American political system, but still wanting to be engaged. You have the Ismaili Shias, who I don't want to generalize, but they typically, due to the Aga Khan, have more of involvement in secularized society. And then you have the Ahmadis, who, kind of putting aside what other Muslims may think of them, they are still a very sizable, involved party of Muslims that overlap 90% of what all other Muslims practice, and they have a good presence here in America. And that's just the religious aspect. Then you have the differences in Americans born here, second, third generation, blacks, and then still people coming from abroad, whether they be Arab or Pakistani or Indian, Afghani, whatever. You have all this diversity. How do you build that foundation of how you're going to engage politically, and what goals are you going to establish due to all this diversity? Where do you come to the common point? And you'll undoubtedly have conflicts along the way. Who takes on the leadership mantle for that? I know that was a little bit of a, couple of questions there, but generally I'm asking, with all this diversity, how do we come to establishing what that cornerstone is, or what that building block is? So, Jazakallah khair.
Wa yakum. So before I answer, would Brother Shah like to jump in on that answer, or Dr. Amir or Hassan, or would you like me to answer?
Go ahead, and then I don't think we're going to be able to finish all questions because it is 10:30. So if you want to, like,
Not that anybody cares to stay, but I'm willing to stay as long as anybody has questions. So, so
Hey, Mouhannad, you're
sorry.
Assalamu alaikum, Mouhannad.
Walaikum salam.
So you're a public defender, right? Every day you work in the system and you're part of the system, and you're trying to.
Hold on 1 second. I just want to say, are we tabling Ali's question real quick?
Yeah. So Nu'man, we have Nu'man. Can you hold on? So Nu'man, we have because Brother Khalid and then Nu'man. So go ahead, Mouhannad. If you can answer.
So briefly, and I'm sure Ali, it's good to hear your voice, and I'd love to continue the conversation outside of here. So forgive me if the answer is just brief and uncomprehensive. But briefly, I will distinguish between our racial differences, ethnic differences, backgrounds, etc., and more substantive. Because if I'm saying that the goals have to be Islamic and there has to be Islam at the center of stuff and substantive, then obviously sometimes there are going to be some distinctions in our broader community. But you bring up an interesting point, which is, why is it that in this community, maybe a while ago, it was understandable, you had a very self-taught, and it's quite an accomplishment, a very self-taught and self-developed, against all odds, if you will, Black Muslim community that came up in this country, maybe partly under NOI, but even when they split off, you had these immigrants largely coming in. You have constant conversion that's happening. So I get for a while why I was segregated, but one of the answers to your questions, actually kind of in the question itself, is that you have all this diversity, but why do we see certain diversity as being like a splintering? Why isn't there should be, we're only 1% of the country, but I think we're weaker than 1% because we have masjids where, I get there's a language barrier to an extent, but we have masjids where it's predominantly Arab, and masjids where it's predominantly Indo-Pak, and masjids where it's predominantly Black, or otherwise, right? So why are we not, one of the things we need to do is in the answer, right? One of the things we need to do is work on, and this goes to Brother Shah's question, when we say our priority is our community, our commitment to establishing our deen, we need to take an honest survey of our community. What is our community's position as it stands? Do we really know, does our leadership really know who are the most financially disenfranchised in the community? Where are all the members of our community located? How are we establishing our institutions to better service the entire community? First, the entire Muslim community, and then the broader community. What active efforts are we doing to pull people into the community and to service them within the community? Leadership is going to come out. In Islam, leadership is a product of service. One of the most interesting, I think, psychological things to study about politics in America today is this idea that people go around the country asking you for your money to support them becoming a leader, and basically, living at your expense and asking you to basically foot the burden for their leadership. Whereas leadership in Islam is an area of sacrifice. We didn't used to have to ask about 15, 20 years ago, just in this community, if you asked, who are the leaders of the Muslim community in Tampa? Before we had all our institutions and all our fancy whatever, and the internet and every pundit and every wannabe activist and every whoever, who are the leaders in this community? And it was beyond a doubt who the leaders were in this community. And it wasn't actually based on, it was actually quite admirable. I remember growing up in Tampa in the mid 90s, early 2000s, and the leaders of the community were largely people, there were some that were affluent, but most of the most respected leaders, like who pushed our agendas in the community, had less income, were very racially diverse, had very diverse backgrounds culturally coming up, whether they were raised Muslim or not, whether they immigrated or second generation, and had even various backgrounds in their Islamic knowledge. Only some had attained a certain level of Islamic scholarship. I remember very clearly growing up in a masjid where Allah yarhamu Imam Sultan, Allah yarhamu Brother Ismail, Allah yarhamu Brother Hamidullah, those were the leaders, right? And so, for me, there's much details we can get into, but when we say our goal is to establish our deen, we have to establish schools that teach Islam, that the curriculum is centered around Islam. We have schools that are increasingly making Islamic studies optional. We have to establish masjids where the center of all kinds of engagement. We have to establish organizations that approach our political, legal, whatever problems from an Islamic perspective. You could take any example, right? You could take even when we talk about broader community, what the sister was talking about, how do we impact our society? We have immigration attorneys at CARE. I think CARE could be largely, it only has immigration attorneys. We can, instead of spending so much effort to try to put out PR to assimilate, why don't we put money in the hands of attorneys to handle immigration cases where that is a serious issue, especially here in Florida or currently. So I think there's all kinds of things we can talk about, from education to religion to policy, and building up our institutions, each one serving a different purpose, but being goal-oriented in establishing our deen, protecting our community.
Let me cut you off real quick, sorry.
Yeah.
What I want to do now, I don't think we're going to be able to reach our questions, but I do want to give an opportunity to 3 other brothers that wanted to ask them, and we don't necessarily ask, but at least, and then inshallah we can probably continue this on later. But one thing I did want to mention, the goal tonight is to not answer everything and not to go over everything. It's not possible. All right. It was to start a discussion, all right, to give a viewpoint about political engagement from the Muslim perspective, and was to set a premise for the discussion. From that comes a lot of other details and so forth. So it's not the end discussion, inshallah, it's the beginning to further discussion later. But I do want to give Anas, who has been waiting, Khalid, and then Nu'man to ask their questions. If you guys can do it in a minute each, inshallah. So we'll start off with Anas. If Anas can go ahead. Are you there, Anas?
Assalamu alaikum, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, so there was talk about, lesser of two evils on voting for presidential, and Brother Mouhannad even talked about local. I wanted to ask about more of a representation and just being there for people to see us. I've heard about that idea as well. We need people like say Ilhan, Omar, or whatever to be out there so people can see Muslims are in the community, and that if we don't, then anti-Muslim laws will be put into effect. And another thing is a lot of times, okay, we need, as even if it's not politics, but civil institutions, like maybe a Muslim institution has to reach out to maybe a LGBT community to make them on our side, even if it's not talking about voting. It's just even there's talk even about that it's lesser than two evil is to reach out to that community so they have our backs even on local level.
So quickly, I don't buy the representation argument. I think representation is this, I mentioned it briefly in the thing, but representation that's substanceless can actually hurt you. People having a kind of and I'm not talking about anyone specifically. I know you mentioned a name, but I'm going to keep it away from names. But generally, having an Uncle Tom, if you will, isn't a positive, right? If there was one thing I actually think that was, I used to say that the Black community could teach a lot to the immigrant community about American politics and American struggle and the reality of American politics. But one thing the immigrant community could probably give to the native-born American community is this anti-representation argument. And quickly, you could just say basically every leader in Egypt is Egyptian. Every leader in Syria is Syrian. Every leader in Saudi is Saudi. We should be very well aware that this idea of representation is nonsense. And it's a very attenuated argument that simply by having a face there, that somehow prevents. In fact, there's an argument that much of the Donald Trump kind of the boiling of his base that gave us Donald Trump came as a reaction to Barack Obama. So the substantive, because there's a real racist undercurrent in this country. And so even though I have gripes with Barack Obama, it's not because he's Black, but a lot of people's gripes with him is because he's Black. So this idea that representation is just going to, this is just going to fix things. No, it has to be substantive representation. Secondly, about this engagement with whatever community it might be, I don't know what you're fashioning as engagement. There's no issue with engaging another community. There's no issue with anyone supporting our political initiatives on our terms. The issue is that when alliances are made nowadays, they are made kind of like a Twitter or Instagram, follow me, I'll follow you. There are alliances to support each other's causes. And the truth is, we're often told, but they won't support us if we don't support them. Go into any kind of discussion go into any kind of organization that's organizing for any of these causes that we have moral problems with, and say, hey, here's our platform, and introduce what you believe is good and evil, and what's moral and improper, what your social platform is. And they're not going to accept it. There isn't this kind of quid pro quo. We're supporting them, they're supporting us. They're supporting us on their terms, and we're being asked to support them on their terms, and that's not acceptable. We will support. I worked with several people within a certain community on a year-long immigration project in Georgia for access to education for undocumented immigrants, because that's exactly what we were working on. I don't care what community they may belong to or whatever, but I am not going to blanket endorse or blanket ally or censor our own views and neuter ourselves so we can get the support of someone else. It's a very simple thing. The reason we're politically engaged as 1% of the population supposedly is to protect our interests, and our interests being the preservation of our deen. So when we sacrifice the preservation of our deen to get the political engagement, then we've lost the plot. If I have $1 million and I'm scared that someone's going to rob me, and somebody comes and says, hey, I got a perfect solution for you. I got 10 bodyguards. You pay them $100,000 a piece. I guarantee you no one's going to mess with you. It's like, yeah, because I gave up the very thing that I was supposedly trying to protect. When we bastardize what we have, it isn't a good compromise. Go ahead.
The idea wasn't to answer all the questions. I just wanted them to ask.
Sorry, go ahead. So
if Khalid and if you guys can just ask your question in 30 seconds, and then we inshallah will save it for next one. So go ahead, Khalid. I know you've been waiting. Khalid Rahman, are you there?
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. So, my question was kind of related to earlier in the talk. You were kind of equating the progressive side and the more left-wing side with the liberals and the right wing, in that they're equally as dangerous to the Muslim cause, right? And so I kind of want to just dig into that and ask you, so what I see from the progressives or the left is the only group in American politics that actually criticizes the obscene economic injustice, which affects Muslims not just at home, not just here in America, but also overseas, right? And so when you talk about the Muslim community, you're talking about a community that has immigrants, that has a lot of poor people that are very, harmful. It's very harmful, this system that allows people to amass billions and billions of dollars while, the masses are in poverty. And then you talk about the American imperialism that goes overseas and steals their resources and destroys their countries. And that's completely driven by this power imbalance that is perpetuated by this system. And then when you see with the progressives, they're also the only voice that actually does, to an extent, right? Not enough, but they speak out for Palestine. They speak out against a lot of Yemen and a lot of these causes against these interventions. So we're seeing the one group that actually does have a criticism of this inequality that does also drive this imperialism that harms the Muslims abroad and at home. So
where they make those points, we agree with them. Where they, for example, and not all of it, but I will tell you, where they criticize the actions in Yemen or the alliance with Saudi or all this other stuff, we agree with them. And just because certain people in a base say something, a lot of the base that pushed for Obama was so fed up with the Iraq war. That doesn't mean that the political party or what their representatives are going to be about support that. Number one. So we do have agreements. Nobody's saying we don't have agreements. Lefts and progressives often have good criticism of the right, and some people on the right have some good criticisms of people on the left as well in terms of morality, social well-being, etc. And I will point out just very, very briefly that just on the economic analysis, there is a missing part of economic analysis, because many people on the left are actually not so their economic solutions. Yes, they're worried about poverty here, but let me just finish the sentence. The poverty, their solutions are often built on actually a sustaining of poverty overseas. But we can get into discussions.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. I think the criticism doesn't go far enough, for sure.
Yeah. The last person, Norman, can you make this really short, please? Go ahead, Norman.
Assalamu alaikum, Mouhannad. I was just saying, you're a public defender, so you have a lot of experience in the criminal justice system, and you can very easily see like the effect a local election can have on a district attorney who represents the people in a much better way. Like I say, if the people of Hillsborough County voted for a better district attorney, we would have an end to cash bail. We would have a far more expansive conviction integrity unit. We would decriminalize drug possession and decriminalize drug addiction. And then
you do know that Hillsborough County has what is considered a very progressive district attorney, correct?
Yeah, I don't think he's progressive enough. I don't think he's progressive at all.
That's my point. That's my point.
I'm saying if we did, but I'm saying if we did have a district attorney that represented the people in a much better way, we would have more effect. And like, I'll give you an example. There's like a hadith of Rasulullah when he tells, I mean, there's so many Sahih narrations in this particular context of when he says and advises the Sahaba to remove harmful things from the roads of the Muslims. Right. Well, what happens if we elect leaders that remove harmful things for the Muslims at a mass scale, such as medical debt, such as student loans, such as ending payday loan debt that charges interest at ridiculous rates?
Sure.
What if we elect these leaders that make a difference in a substantive manner in a mass scale? And
hold on,
we want to see change in a mass scale.
I get it. I get it. But you, I get the question. Respectfully, I get the question. What you jumped from is something I agree with, which, take a specific example. If you can give me a DA who will have a specific approach to prosecution, and we know that, and we can rely on it at least reasonably, and would potentially putting that DA in charge be a good idea? I'm not against that argument. But we jump from that to conclusory statements. Well, what if we could elect people on a mass scale who make great improvements? And there's a big disconnect. The whole point of the practical part of this discussion was to say that is very conclusory statement that's not based in reality. Number one, you have people who are putting very active harms in the road, as opposed to just removing some harms from the road. And you're not going to get into an analysis. We don't have the time right now to get into an analysis of the 40 harms somebody just put in the road and made have take 2 harms off, etc. The whole point as a summary was to say there was much more harm being done than good, and supporting was an issue. And then I'll finish with a hadith, since that is really our metric. And the Prophet ﷺ said, if you see a harm, change it with your hands. And if you can't change it, I'm paraphrasing, if you can't change it with your hands, change it with your tongue, speak against it. And if you can't, you have to hate it in your heart. What I submit and what I propose that our political engagement is that we've gone completely down that ladder. We stopped changing things with our hands. We stopped speaking out against things because of the political sensibilities in this country, especially the immigrant community. Came here, definitely didn't get involved with their hands, stopped speaking out about things, and eventually over time we stopped hating things in our heart. And in fact, then we switched over, and our heart started to feel for and find commitment and love and attachment to certain sensibilities that are not Islamic. And then we started speaking out for those things, and now we're acting out in support of those things. And what you end up having with our political engagement is that you end up with people who aren't rooted in some sort of Islamic reduction of harm principle. Their actual very definition of harm and good isn't necessarily rooted in Islam. And just because we have some overlapping views, so just because we say, it's not enough to say poverty is bad and the criminal justice system isn't good. Number one, you have to know what these people are actually doing in those systems. And number two, you have to actually look at what our goals are and how would we achieve them, right? So I agree with you. A good local DA may be a very big difference maker. And if we can reasonably be certain of someone like that, who doesn't have a corresponding greater harm, maybe. But if you're talking, then you jump and say, well, on a national level, somebody who can remove a harm, as Dr. Rami said, we're not dealing with somebody who's just going and we're saying, no, out of ideology, I won't let you remove that harm. No, this is a person who's coming with tons of harm, which we've outlined, a harm that is much more serious and much more quantifiably great than what you may point to as a speculation that they may remove, even though we don't really often have good proof of what they will do. And our track record says it actually, much of what we speculate isn't true.
But like for a politician, say like Bernie Sanders, who doesn't take money from corporations, he would have made a gigantic impact on actual people's lives if he was elected.
First of
And I
all,
think your
we don't know
analysis
that.
omits the fact that like there's a big differences from politicians who don't take money from corporations and politicians that do.
Well, I
And-
didn't discuss that, and I think we're running late. And I would love to have this discussion.
Well,
I
let me,
actually didn't even
So
discuss.
how are we going to have a political discussion about political engagement without even mentioning how much influence corporations have on our politics?
They have a great amount of influence, brother.
Billionaires have on our politics in our everyday lives.
So
I think
so let
we
me.
should go for part two for next week. Because
So
honestly, there's not-
sorry to cut you off, Habib Ram. So I want to say, guys, I think we can, like I said, there's been sisters that she mentioned some comments, and
If the sister said something, you can just read it at least, and then
yeah. So I know you can't see it. So is this that indigenous Muslims have a different story? We have been slavery fighting from day one of slavery. You're giving hopeless situation. So the idea is and there's other comments that we will save inshallah, and we will inshallah profess. But the thing is, today we didn't really focus too much on the goals. That's going to be a separate discussion. Actual questions that Nu'man and some others brought, also local versus national. We didn't dive too much into, even though the today what was the main thing is to establish the principle of political engagement, inshallah. And now we didn't necessarily make any conclusive statements either way. So I would say, inshallah, we'll continue this. We will keep everyone updated, and we'll have a post on it for inshallah in the future. And that being said, anything that is correct or from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, any shortcomings is from ourselves. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us. Now, one thing I do want to say is that I do appreciate everyone being patient and